I never thought my own signature could become a weapon against me. But there it was, on documents I had never seen before, authorizing things I would never agree to. My hand trembled as I held the papers Detective Morrison had shown me, realizing that someone very close to me had been planning my downfall for months. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 73, I thought I had seen enough of life's cruelties to recognize them coming. I was wrong. The betrayal that nearly destroyed me came wrapped in concern, disguised as love, and delivered by someone who called me mother. The Victorian house on Elm Street had been my sanctuary for 45 years. Richard and I had bought it as newlyweds, when the neighborhood was still rough around the edges and we could barely afford the down payment. We painted every room ourselves, planted the garden with our own hands, and raised our son David within those walls. After Richard passed, 3 years ago, the house became more than a home. It became my connection to everything I had lost and everything I still cherished. David moved back in 6 months after his father's funeral. At first, I was grateful for the company. The silence had been overwhelming, and having my son's laughter fill the rooms again felt like a small miracle. He brought Sandra, his new girlfriend, who seemed pleasant enough. She was 35 to his 42, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a wardrobe that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. But she smiled warmly and called me Mom from the very first day, so I welcomed her with open arms. The changes started small. Sandra mentioned that the wallpaper in the dining room looked dated. She suggested we might want to update the kitchen appliances. She commented on how the garden could use some professional landscaping. Each suggestion came with a sweet smile and was framed as wanting to help me maintain my beautiful home. I found myself nodding along, even agreeing to small improvements here and there. Within a month, Sandra had taken over most of the household management. She said I shouldn't worry about bills and paperwork at my age. She offered to handle the grocery shopping because she knew exactly what David liked. She began referring to various rooms as needing this or that improvement, always speaking as if the decisions had already been made. When I expressed uncertainty about some of the more expensive suggestions, she would pat my hand gently and say she just wanted me to be comfortable and safe. The first real warning sign came when I found her in Richard's study, going through his filing cabinet. She looked up with that same warm smile and explained that David had asked her to help organize the important papers. She said they were worried about me keeping track of everything and wanted to make sure nothing important got lost. The explanation sounded reasonable, but something cold settled in my stomach as I watched her confidently rifling through documents that contained the most private details of my life. Later that evening, David approached me with a serious expression. He sat down beside me on the couch where Richard and I used to watch our evening shows and took my hands in his. He said he and Sandra had been talking about my future, about making sure I would be taken care of as I got older. He mentioned something about power of attorney, about making things simpler for me. The conversation felt rehearsed, as if he had practiced these words beforehand. I told him I wasn't ready to think about such things, that I was managing fine on my own. David's face fell, and he looked genuinely hurt. He said he was only trying to look out for me, that he couldn't bear the thought of something happening to me while I was trying to handle everything alone. Sandra appeared in the doorway just then, as if she had been listening from the hall. She came over and sat on my other side, creating a circle of concern that felt more like a trap. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. They began pointing out small mistakes I made. When I forgot to pay the electric bill on time, Sandra gently reminded me that this was exactly the kind of thing they were worried about. When I misplaced my reading glasses, David suggested that maybe I was having more memory problems than I realized. Each incident was met with loving concern, but I began to feel like I was being watched and evaluated constantly. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in November. I had gone to the bank to make a routine deposit, something I had been doing for decades. The teller, Mrs. Patterson, who had known me for years, looked uncomfortable as she processed my transaction. She hesitated for a moment, then asked if I was aware that there had been some recent activity on my account. She showed me a printout that made my blood run cold. Someone had been making regular transfers from my savings account to an account I didn't recognize. The amounts weren't huge, but they had been going on for months. Mrs. Patterson explained that the transfers had been authorized by someone with power of attorney over my accounts. I stared at the papers in complete confusion. I had never signed any power of attorney documents. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I walked into the house, I found Sandra on the phone in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. She quickly ended the call when she saw me and asked how my day had gone. I couldn't bring myself to confront her immediately. Instead, I went to Richard's study and began searching through the filing cabinet myself. That's when I found them. Documents with my signature, authorizing Sandra as my power of attorney. Legal papers giving her access to my bank accounts. Forms that I had absolutely no memory of signing. My signature looked perfect, but I knew I had never seen these documents before in my life. The dates went back 4 months, to a time when Sandra claimed to be helping me organize my paperwork. I sat in Richard's chair, holding those forged documents, and felt something break apart inside me. The woman I had welcomed into my home, who had called me mother and held my hands while speaking of love and concern, had been systematically stealing from me while planning to take control of my entire life. Worse still, my own son was either involved or willfully blind to what was happening under his nose. That evening, I confronted them both. I placed the bank statements and forged documents on the kitchen table and asked for an explanation. Sandra's mask slipped for just a moment. I saw something cold and calculating flash across her features before the concerned expression returned. She claimed she had no idea what I was talking about, that perhaps I was confused or misremembering. David looked genuinely shocked, but when I pressed him about what he knew, his answers were vague and defensive. Sandra suggested that my confusion and paranoia were signs that I needed more help than they had realized. She spoke about elder care facilities where I would be safe and well looked after. David nodded along, saying they only wanted what was best for me. As I listened to them discuss my future as if I weren't sitting right there, I realized that this had always been the plan. The loving concern, the gradual takeover of my affairs, the forged documents. They had been grooming me for this moment, when they could declare me incompetent and take control of everything Richard and I had built together. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my old friend Helen, who had been a paralegal before retirement. Through tears, I explained what I had discovered. Helen listened without judgment, and then said something that changed everything. She told me I wasn't going crazy, that what I was describing was a form of elder abuse that was more common than most people realized. She gave me the name of a lawyer who specialized in these cases and offered to drive me to the appointment herself. Attorney Jennifer Walsh was younger than I had expected, but her eyes were sharp and compassionate. She listened to my story, examined the documents I brought, and asked detailed questions about Sandra's behavior over the past months. She explained that what had happened to me was financial elder abuse, and that the forged power of attorney documents were evidence of fraud. She said I had legal recourse, but that I needed to act quickly to protect my remaining assets. The first step was getting the fraudulent power of attorney revoked and securing my accounts. Jennifer helped me contact the bank and freeze any further unauthorized activity. She also advised me to document everything I could remember about Sandra's behavior and any statements David had made about managing my affairs. Most importantly, she warned me that Sandra would likely escalate her efforts once she realized her scheme had been discovered. I was right to be worried. When I returned home that afternoon, I found Sandra waiting for me in the living room. The warm mask was completely gone now, replaced by something sharp and predatory. She told me she knew I had been to see a lawyer and that I was making a terrible mistake. She said David was having doubts about my mental capacity, that my paranoid behavior was concerning everyone who cared about me. Then came the threat I had been dreading. Sandra smiled sweetly and said it would be such a shame if something happened to me, if I had an accident or became too confused to take care of myself. She mentioned how easy it would be for concerned family members to have me evaluated for competency. She suggested that cooperating with their original plan would be much easier than fighting a legal battle that could drag on for years while my reputation and relationships were destroyed. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Richard, about the life we had built together, and about how he would want me to handle this situation. I thought about the women I had known over the years who had been taken advantage of by family members or caregivers. I realized that Sandra was counting on my shame, my desire to keep family matters private, and my fear of confrontation. She was betting that I would choose the path of least resistance rather than fight for my rights and dignity. The next day, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I called Detective Morrison, the officer Jennifer Walsh had recommended for cases involving elder fraud. I told him I wanted to file a criminal complaint against Sandra for forgery and financial elder abuse. The detective was thorough and professional, treating my case with the seriousness it deserved. He explained that elder fraud was a growing problem, and that they had been seeing more sophisticated schemes, like the one Sandra had orchestrated. The investigation moved quickly once it started. Detective Morrison was able to trace the money that had been transferred from my accounts. It turned out Sandra had been using the stolen funds to pay for her expensive lifestyle, including clothes, spa treatments, and lease payments on a luxury car. She had also been making plans to use the equity in my house as collateral for a business loan she wanted to start. Meanwhile, Jennifer Walsh filed for an emergency restraining order to keep Sandra away from me and my property. The legal proceedings were emotionally draining, but I felt stronger with each step. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my own life. David's reaction was the most painful part of the entire ordeal. When he learned about the criminal charges against Sandra, he accused me of destroying his relationship and ruining their future together. He claimed Sandra had only been trying to help, that I was being vindictive and cruel. He moved out of the house and cut off most communication with me. The loss of my son's support felt like losing Richard all over again. But I also discovered something unexpected during this dark time. Once word got out about what had happened, other people began sharing their own stories with me. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, told me about her sister, who had been swindled by a caregiver. Helen introduced me to two other women from her church who had experienced similar betrayals by family members. I realized I wasn't alone in this experience, and that by speaking up, I was helping to shine light on a problem that too often remained hidden. The criminal case against Sandra took several months to resolve. During that time, I worked with Jennifer to recover as much of my stolen money as possible. We were able to get back about 60% of what had been taken, though some had been spent in ways that couldn't be reversed. More importantly, I was able to maintain control of my house and my remaining assets. Sandra eventually pled guilty to fraud charges rather than face a trial. She received a sentence of 2 years probation and was ordered to pay restitution for the money she had stolen. The judge also issued a permanent restraining order, preventing her from contacting me or coming near my property. During the sentencing hearing, I chose to make a victim impact statement. Standing in that courtroom, looking at the woman who had called me mother while plotting to steal my independence, I felt a mixture of anger and sadness. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: my own strength. I told the court about the betrayal of trust, about the fear I had lived with, and about the damage that had been done to my relationship with my son. But I also talked about the importance of speaking up, of not allowing shame or fear to prevent victims from seeking justice. After the legal proceedings ended, I faced the challenge of rebuilding my life and my sense of security. The house felt different now, tainted by the memories of Sandra's deception. I considered selling it and moving somewhere smaller, but I realized that would be letting her win in a different way. Instead, I decided to reclaim my home and make it truly mine again. I started with Richard's study, which Sandra had invaded so thoroughly. I went through every document, every file, reorganizing everything according to my own system. I found letters Richard had written to me during our courtship, photos from our early years together, and small mementos I had forgotten were there. The process was like rediscovering parts of myself that I had allowed to become buried under Sandra's manipulation. The next step was reconnecting with people who had been part of my life before David and Sandra moved in. I had gradually lost touch with several friends during those months, when Sandra was managing more and more of my daily life. I reached out to my book club, which I had stopped attending. I called my cousin Patricia, who lived across town. I began volunteering at the community center, something I had always enjoyed but had given up when Sandra suggested I shouldn't be driving so much. The hardest part was dealing with the ongoing rift with David. For several months after Sandra's sentencing, we had no contact at all. I missed him terribly. But I also recognized that rebuilding our relationship would require him to acknowledge what had really happened. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine just to have my son back in my life. Eventually, David called me. Sandra had left town after completing her probation, and their relationship had ended badly. He said he had been doing some thinking about everything that had happened. The conversation was awkward and painful. But it was a start. David admitted that he had seen warning signs about Sandra's behavior, but had chosen to ignore them because he didn't want to lose her. He apologized for not believing me when I first tried to tell him what was happening. Our relationship is still rebuilding, slowly and carefully. David comes to visit once a week now, and we talk on the phone regularly. He's been seeing a counselor to work through his own issues with the situation. I think he's genuinely remorseful, but I've also learned to maintain clearer boundaries about what I will and won't tolerate. I love my son, but I won't sacrifice my well-being or autonomy to maintain a relationship with him or anyone else. The experience taught me things about myself that I might never have learned otherwise. I discovered that I was stronger and more resilient than I had believed. I learned that speaking up for myself, even when it was difficult and scary, was essential to maintaining my dignity and independence. I realized that true love and concern never require someone to give up their autonomy or live in fear. I also learned to trust my instincts again. During those months with Sandra, I had begun to doubt my own perceptions and memories. Her gaslighting had been so consistent and subtle that I started to believe maybe I really was becoming confused and incompetent. Going through the legal process and having my experiences validated by professionals helped me understand that my instincts had been right all along. Today, at 74, I live alone in my house on Elm Street, and I cherish my independence. I've made new friends through my volunteer work and maintained the old friendships that Sandra's manipulation had strained. I have a security system now and a financial advisor who specializes in protecting seniors from fraud. I've also become something of an advocate for other elderly people who find themselves in similar situations. I speak at community centers and senior living facilities about the warning signs of elder abuse. I share my story not because I want sympathy, but because I want other people to know they're not alone and that they have options. Too many older adults suffer in silence because they're ashamed or afraid, or because they don't want to cause trouble within their families. I want them to know that protecting themselves isn't selfish, and that they deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their age. The garden that Sandra had wanted to replace with professional landscaping is now more beautiful than ever. I tend it myself, with some help from a neighborhood teenager who enjoys learning about plants. The vegetables I grow feed me, and several neighbors throughout the summer. The flowers Richard and I planted decades ago continue to bloom each spring, a reminder that some things endure, despite attempts to uproot them. I still miss Richard every day, but I no longer feel overwhelmed by loneliness. The life I've built for myself is quieter than it once was, but it's authentically mine. No one else makes decisions about my money, my health care, or my daily routine. I choose how to spend my time, and with whom to spend it. These might seem like small things, but for someone who almost lost the right to make such choices, they feel like precious gifts. The legal victory over Sandra was important, but the personal victory was even more significant. I proved to myself that I could stand up to intimidation and manipulation. I demonstrated that age doesn't automatically mean vulnerability, and that respect is something to be demanded, not just hoped for. I learned that sometimes the people who claim to love us the most are the ones we need to be most careful around. Most importantly, I discovered that it's never too late to reclaim your life. At an age when many people feel their options are limited, I found new strength, new purpose, and new possibilities. The betrayal that nearly destroyed me ultimately became the catalyst for a kind of rebirth. I am not the same woman who welcomed Sandra into my home with trusting arms, and I'm grateful for that transformation. As I sit in my kitchen each morning, drinking coffee from the mug Richard gave me for our 20th anniversary, I think about the day ahead and the choices it will bring. They're my choices to make, for better or worse. That simple fact, which I had taken for granted for most of my adult life, now feels like the greatest blessing of all. I am still here, still whole, still capable of growth and change and joy. Sandra tried to steal my future, but instead, she accidentally gave me the gift of truly valuing my present.